Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well.
The following program is hosted by the NBG Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And if you didn't notice, at the very beginning of the podcast, something new has been added. So it's my privilege to announce that this episode is the first episode for A Moment with Eric Fleming to be on the NBG Podcast Network. It has really been an honor and a privilege to be invited to join, and I want to thank Leonard Young for making that happen. NBG is a Black-owned, Black-operated podcast network, and so I look forward to a long relationship. And, you know, this podcast has come a long way from just me recording my Uber rants and now to actually be on an actual podcast network is a major accomplishment. The other housekeeping note I wanted to mention is that we did not win this year for Best News and Political Podcast, but I want to thank the Black Podcasting Awards for nominating A Moment with Eric Fleming for the second time in our 5-year journey. And I want to congratulate Rashad Ritchie, who did win, and you need to check his podcast out. It's called Indisputable. And Rashad's got so many titles. He's got law degrees, a PhD. He's got all sorts of stuff going on. So I just call him Brother Rashad. And I respected that brother from afar. We met maybe once. But congratulations to him. And congratulations to all the winners of the Black Pod Awards this year. Please check out their website to see who won. Please check out and see who was nominated. And make sure that you follow or listen to those podcasts that had the same distinction to me of being nominated, because it's an honor to be recognized for the work that you do. And, you know, I'm going to continue to keep doing what I'm doing. And I hope that the other content creators keep doing what they're doing, and encourage y'all to always listen to us. So now that I got that out the way, let me just say that this episode is going to be special because I'm going to be dealing with a couple of subjects. One is going to be kind of heavy, and one is not as heavy, but very important. And I'm really was honored to have these ladies come on to talk about their particular subjects. And I can't wait for y'all to hear those interviews. So let's go ahead and kick this off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. Marcellus Williams was executed by lethal injection in Missouri after the U.S. Supreme Court denied his appeal, despite claims of new evidence regarding jury bias and the murder weapons contamination. The U.S. Congress passed a stopgap bill to prevent a government shutdown, ensuring funding through December 20th. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has been indicted in a federal corruption investigation. Donald Trump declined to take part in another debate with Vice President Kamala Harris, citing the late timing as voters have already begun casting ballots in 3 states. Georgia's election board voted for a hand count of ballots for the upcoming election, a decision criticized by voting rights advocates. A Republican proposal to switch Nebraska's electoral college votes to a winner-takes-all system failed to receive the unanimous Republican support needed to pass. Several aides to North Carolina's Republican gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson resigned following controversial comments attributed to him. A judge upheld the acceptance of digital university IDs for voting in North Carolina, allowing college students to participate in the upcoming election. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld a ruling that keeps the Green Party off the Nevada ballot. U.S. Army Private Travis King was sentenced to 1 year of confinement for several offenses, including desertion after fleeing to North Korea. Families of 6 workers who died in the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse filed lawsuits against the cargo ship's owner and operator. The FBI reported a 3% decline in violent crime in the U.S. last year, alongside an increase in hate crimes. And a Joint Center report reveals that the U.S. public workforce system may be reinforcing racial disparities for Black Americans by channeling them into low-paying jobs. I am Grace G, and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for my guest, Rachel Zimmerman. Rachel Zimmerman, an award-winning journalist, has written about health and medicine for more than 2 decades. She is a contributor to the Washington Post and previously worked as a staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and a health reporter for WBUR, Boston's public radio station, where she co-founded a popular blog and podcast. Her essays and reporting have been published in the New York Times, Vogue.com, New York Magazine's The Cut, the Oprah Magazine, The Atlantic, Slate, and the Huffington Post, among others. She received an MS from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and a BA from Sarah Lawrence College. She lives with her family in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is the author of the new book, Us After, a memoir of love and suicide. And this is the book we're going to discuss in the interview. Now, the subject matter of this interview may be disturbing. If you are having thoughts of suicide, please reach out for help. Call or text 988 for the Suicide Crisis Lifeline, or go to www.speakingofsuicide.com/resources for any additional resources you may need. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest On this podcast, Rachel Zimmerman. All right. Rachel Zimmerman. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm doing okay today. How are you doing, Eric?
The same. I'm doing good. I'm doing okay. I really appreciate you coming on, but even more so, I really appreciate this book that you've written called Us After, a memoir of love and suicide. And in the questioning, I'll kind of get into the personal aspect of it, but, I'll just say this to editorialize a little bit. I'm really, really proud and honored that you summoned the courage to do this. I know this was like a 10-year effort from what I've read in the book.
That's right.
And, so I greatly appreciate that you summoned the courage to do that. So let's go ahead and get started. What I normally do with guests is that I throw a quote at them and then have them respond. So your quote is, "At the end of my suffering, there was a door." What does that quote mean to you?
Well, that's a quote I have included in the book, and it's the poet Louise Gluck from her poem, The Wild Iris. And to me, what I've learned from doing all the reporting from this book and talking to other people, doing book events, is so many people have trauma and loss, right? So many people have suffering. It's the human condition if you're an adult, basically. And so my feeling is when you're in the acute moment of grief and suffering, you feel like there's no way out. And yet, for many people, a door opens and you evolve and life goes on, and you don't imagine that to happen. And I think that's what that quote means to me, that you are forced against your will. I mean, nobody asks for these kind of destructive, devastating life events, right? But they happen to most of us, if not all of us. And you have a choice to go on or not. And you, most of the time, have to pivot and take care of your kids and take care of your daily demands. And so that's the door that opens. And a lot of this book, we'll get into it, but sort of a motivating factor was sort of finding the good in what remains. And so that quote speaks to that concept.
So normally when I interview authors, I don't quote total passages from the book. But for my first couple of questions, because the way the book starts, I want to read that. Because it really, really hit me. It's like good literature is like the opening is what's supposed to be the hook, right? And
Right.
So let me read this. "If I were writing a news story, I'd start like this. On July 1st, 2014, Seth Teller, MIT professor and father of two, parked his crimson Honda Insight on the Tobin Bridge 3 miles from his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and jumped to his death. He was 50. But this is not that story. This is the story of what happened after." So my two questions. My first question is, you were married to Seth for 12 years.
That's right.
And I guess you dated for 3 years, because a lot of times you refer to 15 years when you're talking. Talk to me about him. I know he was like a super smart individual, and he had these incredible projects that he's working on, but just talk to me about Seth, the husband.
Right. Well, I appreciate you reading that opening, Eric. So Seth was a devoted father of our two daughters, who were 8 and 11 years old when he died. As you mentioned, he was a tenured professor of robotics at MIT, deeply connected with his students. His parents were very close with him, 2 brothers, again, very close. an extended family. So in other words, a very robust social network. He was involved in like the neighborhood association and, you know, the turf fields where he played ultimate frisbee. And he was somebody who, if you just saw him, you'd see this like cool, laid back, brilliant guy. He wore shorts all the time. He often taught classes in shorts. And, you know, he actually had a bottle of bubble mix that he kept in the back of his car with a big wand. And so if he'd run into a group of kids, he'd just take the bubble mix out and start making bubbles for the kids. So he was just like this very fun-loving but brilliant, like he'd stay up all night looking at the stars and coming up with big ideas. But he also was very hard on himself in terms of his expectations of himself. And a friend of mine who recently read the book said it was almost like Seth had a PhD in hiding. And I think he was a perfectionist and he operated on a very high level. And I think, you know, he never was diagnosed with any kind of severe mental illness. But in my investigation and reporting, you know, he obviously had undiagnosed deep depression, and he may have even had bipolar. There was some bipolar in his family, but again, never diagnosed. And I think what happened was there was a lot of stress in his life. He was involved in a, you know, international robotics competition, and he had just turned 50. So that was on his mind. You know, many men are kind of like, what have I accomplished? Like the sort of midlife situation. He had some chronic pain, so he wasn't able to exercise. His sleep had deteriorated near the end. And he had something called tinnitus, which is a ringing in the ear that is fairly common and usually low level. And it never bothered him, but it had escalated. And none of those things on their own pointed to an emergency. But I think for him, these sort of maybe on their own minor intrusions coalesced at the same time and escalated. And because he'd never been in any kind of long-term therapy or ever really asked for help about any kind of mental health situation, he didn't have the tools to deal with that. And so, you know, what I tell my kids, he had an illness in his brain that was undiagnosed, and the consequence of that illness turned out to be self-harm and ultimately, sadly, his death.
Yeah, because that leads to, well, that's another question I'm going to ask dealing with your daughters. But the other question based off that opening was, how did your background as being a journalist help you get through this moment?
Right. Well, I would say it both helped and hindered me in these respects. So I had been a journalist, mostly a healthcare journalist, for over 20 years. Worked at the Wall Street Journal, worked in public radio. And so my belief system, based on a lot of that, my work, was that, you know, you dig deeply, you know, you talk to as many people as you can about a complicated topic, and you emerge with some clarity, right? And you think you can have enough of an answer to write a story that leads readers to some kind of clarity. So I thought I could do that with Seth. So I just started interviewing suicide researchers and doctors and people who knew him in different aspects of his life. And, you know, I found someone who actually jumped off the same bridge and survived. And I thought, okay, he'll give me some insight. And at the end I did this for years, this sort of obsessive digging. And honestly, it helped me focus. It was a good distraction. But at the end of the day, it didn't provide this aha moment about why, nor did it provide an aha moment about what had I missed. Like, of course, as a survivor of someone, you know, you love who dies by suicide, you of course think, how could I have stopped this? What did I miss? That's sort of a human response to that sort of thing. And I came to the understanding that again, an illness in his brain, when you are in that suicidal mindset, you are not thinking about anything else. You're not thinking about your kids, your marriage, your work. You're just thinking about the psychic pain you're in and how do you end it? And then there's a kind of tunnel vision. So, I did come to some clarity in terms of an understanding a bit about what he was going through. But I think, like, unless you have been there, it's very hard to wrap your brain around suicide, right? It's like the very antithesis of everything that is a human impulse, which is to survive. And so there's still an unknowingness about, how he died, which I think never goes away. But you kind of have to learn to live with the unknown and decide to pivot to, like, focus on what you can control and manage, which was, reconnecting with some level of joy and pleasure and making sure my kids could do that as well.
Yeah. So talking about your children, you mentioned them at the beginning. They're basically grown now, but they were 8 and 11 when this happened. And there was one particular passage where you talked about his love for flying, right? That he always wanted to fly, and there was a moment when you were talking to your daughters. I don't know which one was it, Julia or I forget the other one's name. Sophia.
Sophia, yeah.
Right. And it was one of them where you were explaining that maybe at that moment he felt that he was flying. Kind of talk about how difficult that was, because if you read the book, it takes it's almost like every year, it's like you start another chapter in explaining to your children what happened.
Yes, I really appreciate that you highlight that passage, because I sort of at first treated my kids as one unit, like, what will I tell the kids? But because of their age difference and just their personality difference, I soon realized, like, each of them needed different things from me, and developmentally they were different. And so my younger daughter was always the one who wanted all of the facts. Like, she started asking, exactly how did he die? I want to know all the details. When she was 9, not immediately right after he died, but very soon after. And my older daughter never asked for that. I mean, she kind of absorbed the details, but she was more the one who wanted to keep an image of him as she had known him when he was alive and thriving. So the passage you refer to is, finally when I talked to Julia and she's like, how did Daddy die? So I explained, he had this illness and he just, and he jumped. I mean, that was pretty much one of, there are several worst moments of my life. And this was one of them, trying to tell my 9-year-old this. And, I said it to her, and, like, almost at that impulse that you have with your kids when something bad happens, you want to make it better. Like, all you want to do is not have them feel pain, right? So I said, I imagine that for a moment he felt like he was flying before he died. And, he used to say stuff like that to them, of like, would you rather be invisible or would you rather fly? Like, what superpower would you like? And that's how he thought. He thought like a kid on many levels. And so she responded to that. Like, she went with maybe he did have a moment of flight before the end. And, again, there's this sort of, you want to know, you don't want to know. And the fact that she responded to that flying statement made me feel like, okay, she also is able to find some kind of good in this disaster. And, he also used to do a thing with them where they'd make this huge pile of leaves in the fall in Cambridge. There's always, like, the change to autumn is dramatic. And they do leaf jumping. And she said, when I said the thing about flying, she said, oh, I also imagine he felt like he was doing leaf jumping. So it's like she wants to know the gory details, but then she also wants to bring it back to the joy they had together. And yeah, it was an amazing moment. It's like you don't think your kids can absorb this kind of stuff, and they don't metabolize it in the same way that grown-ups do. They understand only what they can understand, and in some ways that's a protective mechanism. Yeah, and my older daughter, I said, I just told Julia exactly how Dad died. Would you like me to tell you to? And she's like, that's okay. I've got it. And yet they always came together in the end to support each other, and we became, part of how we survived was we sort of became this unit, this like 3-girl unit that sort of moved through the world together. Yeah, so that was an extremely painful moment.
Yeah. So that kind of leads me to the next question about support. So you had kind of developed this tribe within the household between you and the daughters. What other because there was one part where you said you reached out to a friend of his who had gone through losing their spouse.
Right.
And that person never responded to you, but you did have a mom brigade, I think you called it, or something like that.
Yeah.
So talk about
essentially. Yeah.
Talk about the different support groups that kind of got you through.
Yeah. Well, I think this is critical to anyone going through this kind of loss. We had amazing, in our very unluckiness, we were actually fairly lucky. First of all, he had left life insurance, and there was a period of time where I wasn't sure we were going to get it because he died by suicide, and there's a suicide clause, but in the end we did. So we were financially stable, and we didn't have to move, and the kids could stay in their school where they had been since they were 4. So there was the school community, which was incredible. There was the neighborhood community, which we got to stay in. Like everything that kept things familiar and stable and consistent helped us go on. And then, as you mentioned, the mom brigade, these women who were largely mothers of my kids' friends just gathered round, and they, left food on my doorstep. They took my phone calls in the middle of the night when I was anxious and freaking out. They drove the kids to their gymnastics and to the birthday parties. And when my kids had to be in 2 places and I couldn't be both places, they would take them. And so that was just so huge. And, I didn't have my kids till I was older. It was my late 30s. I was 38 when I had my first kid and 41 when Julia was born. So I, by that time, had my career. I sort of thought of myself as this knowing older mom, right? And I didn't need help. But soon after Seth died, I realized I cannot do this without help. And then Julia and I went to this grief group for children and families who had lost someone. And she went with the kids downstairs, and they didn't talk about loss and pain and grief. They jumped on a trampoline and did art projects and painted rocks and stuff. But I went upstairs with the grown-ups, and we talked, and I could see, I talk about it in the book, this kind of hierarchy of grief where I saw women who did not, who lost their main source of income and who had to move to smaller places away from their support systems, and the damage that can do to a kid and an adult. And then, there were a couple of dads in the group who apparently really were not part of child rearing. I remember one father saying, I've never made a sandwich for my kid. Or another who was I don't know how to talk to my daughter about her mother's death. And I was very lucky to have these people that I could lean on. And as you say, it's not always the people you think, right? I thought this guy who lost his spouse would really understand, and he couldn't deal. I had a work colleague I was very close to. I assumed she would be a support. And she basically said to me, you have too much pain in your life right now. I can't deal with that. Okay. Sorry about that. But anyway, and then there were other people who were just sort of peripheral in my life, and they came right to the center. So you just don't know how people are going to respond to this kind of thing. There's sometimes a sense that it's, contagious. Like, I had this terrible thing happen, and some people don't want to come in close to that for this irrational fear that it's like going to happen, bad things going to happen to them, which obviously that's not how it works. But yes, the support was, and even still, through this book, I have people checking in on me, like, how's it going? How does it feel to have all this material out there? And honestly, one of the amazing things about putting this material out in the world, because you never know how it's going to land. But in these public events I've done, people just want to share their own stories, and they want to connect, and they want to say, this thing happened to me and it was similar and we never talked about it. And this gives me permission to talk. And I think, from a macro perspective, I really think sharing these kind of stories with each other makes us all more human.
Yeah, and I'm going to put a pin on that because that kind of leads to a question I wanted to ask. But before we get to those, what was the toughest thing? Trying to fulfill the role as a widow in society, or finding love again?
Well, I'm glad the widow thing is interesting because, the conventional wisdom about like what a widow is kind of this old woman in black turtleneck lace who's sort of long suffering and, just in a perpetual state of grief, which, I was not ready to embody that. However, it's a powerful cultural stereotype, and so when my friend about a year after Seth died said, do you want to meet a guy? I was kind of like, is this allowed? Like, what is the norm here and what is acceptable? And, I quickly decided not to care about that and went out for coffee with this guy. And, even he's another professor at MIT, actually, and we had chemistry. He's actually a chemistry professor. And, yeah, but we went very slowly. At our first more than a couple dates, I felt like I was doing something illicit. I just felt like I was violating my marriage vows with Seth. Like, who was I? What am I doing with another person? Like, in some kind of romantic situation? That's not allowed. And at the beginning, I would just kind of look around to see if anybody was watching us. I mean, I honestly felt like I was doing something wrong. And mostly after that, I just didn't want my kids to feel like their father was in any way being replaced. So we just went very slowly, and, I think it was like at least 6 or 9 months after we were dating, we finally he has a daughter 6 months older than my daughter, and we took all the girls to see Pitch Perfect 2. That was like our way of meeting. And, they were really interested in her more than they were interested in him. And I think, on some level, they were happy that I was dating someone because it took the pressure off them on taking care of me. There's somebody else who could take care of me. And so 5 years after Seth died, we married. I remarried and, blended family, and kind of amazing. Like, the girls are all doing their thing, but they call each other sisters, and they're sharing a bathroom. It's not always easy, but we, put a lot of work into it and made it work. So again, back to this idea, my daughter, the day her father died, said to me, "Are we ever going to be happy again?" And I said to her, yes, but I completely didn't believe it. I really thought they were doomed. I didn't think children could recover from this kind of loss, and especially the suicide part, which again remains so incomprehensible. But they did, and now they're both in college. They have fairly healthy relationships. They have passions. They, fight for their causes. And again, the sort of miraculous phenomenon of life going on.
Yeah, it's an incredibly personal book. So did Finding Love Again help with, was that kind of a support, and was writing the book kind of a support for you?
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to end the book with my second marriage to Munji Bawendi, because I really didn't want this sort of cliche of like, oh, I remarried, so problem solved, because obviously it doesn't work that way. Did it take the edge off to have a new partner who I could talk to and vent to and, just share with? Yes, of course it helped. But there was so much more beyond that. And what really helped is like, just because somebody dies, it doesn't mean your relationship with them ends, right? It just shifts dramatically. And so the last chapter of the book, which if you get to the end, is about, 5 years after he dies. I couldn't deal with getting rid of his clothes. So all of his clothes were, put in the basement in garbage bags. And so finally I had to sell my house, and the kids went through his clothes in those garbage bags, and they were like, oh, these are so cool. And like, I'm going to make crop tops out of these t-shirts. And they took his whole bag of socks. And soon I found like all of Seth's clothes around the house, like part of the rotation. And there'd be, there they are wearing them as pajamas. And so like just this sort of metaphor of his presence being still around us is how the book ends. So yeah, it's about my coming to terms with my relationship with him and how he still, how his presence remains. And in terms of writing the book, I mean, people ask, was it like therapy writing the book? And, I think all memoirists have to either struggle with it or just forced to think about, what is the difference between, dumping my feelings in a journal and writing a book that's a memoir? And there's a huge difference, because in a memoir, in a book, you have to create like a narrative arc. You have to make yourself a character, and you have to make all of the people in your world characters. You have to decide what details to include and what not to include. And you have to make it into a compelling story. And so this book was not therapy for me, but on the other hand, I've come to think of the process over 10 years as like me developing a story I can live with. And I think of that really as a major part of grief. Like we have to come to a story we can live with. I mean, here's this person who your brain thinks you're going to wake up with again the next day because you've woken up with them for 15 years. And then suddenly they're not there. And how does your brain make sense of that? So I think more than therapy, the book is making sense of a story after a critical character in the story is no longer there.
Yeah. So, Rachel, this is a political show, so I got to ask you a political question. What should government do to increase support for individuals and families that are struggling with mental illness and or grief from losing a loved one?
That's an excellent question. I mean, we talk about parity in terms of mental and physical health, but we are so not there. I mean, there was a large increase in mental health issues, before the pandemic, but the pandemic made things even worse, right? And the wait time to find a therapist, the accessibility and affordability of mental health providers is terrible in this country. And, you don't have to be suicidal to need a therapist. I mean, a friend of mine's like, we should all have someone we can talk to who, isn't necessarily a family member who could help us organize the complexity and unfairness and, twists and turns of life. And so I think government can make mental health providers more accessible. They can reimburse them. I mean, try to find a therapist who takes your insurance, who has openings, and who you feel is professional enough to, and skilled enough to deal with your particular issue. It is not easy. So anything government can do to subsidize and train and support more mental health providers so that they are easily accessible, I think would go a long way in helping people get the support they need. And also, education. I still think there is stigma in reaching out for help. As much as we talk about everything online and we are all open books because we're all over social media, there is still a sense of shame in reaching out for help. And, as I've told my kids, if there's one lesson out of all of this is it is not a sign of weakness to ask for help. It's a sign of strength.
Right. And, I'm not going to put you in the box. This is my editorial. We have a political figure that's out there that obviously does not get that memo, that any kind of failure, any kind of weakness, any kind of failure is a sign of weakness. And if nothing else, that's why I do not support that particular individual, let alone when we get into politics.
Nor do I. For many, many reasons, a lack of compassion and empathy and a sense of, helping anybody but himself. Yes. I mean, I could do a whole nother series on that, but I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. So, September is Suicide Prevention Month. How do you believe Us After can be an asset to those efforts?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I mentioned, I really hope that it is a point to start conversations among people and families. And one reason I included so many details about my personal situation was, almost like an invitation that it's okay if you don't feel perfect, if your marriage isn't perfect, if you yell at your kids once in a while, like it's not your fault. People suffer for all kinds of reasons, and we try to do the best we can, but life happens. And so I hope this can be, part of the conversation on how we get help, how it's okay to ask for help, and how we support, the people we love when they need help. And I will say, obviously, the material in the book can be triggering to people, and for anybody who needs help, there's help available. You can call or text 988, which is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And they can provide all kinds of resources, free groups, free counseling, but you have to reach in and make the call.
Yeah. And I'm glad you pointed that out. One of the things I want to say from a personal standpoint is, I have been dealing with depression since 2009. And I know that I am different than I was prior to being diagnosed and all the things I was going through. One of the things that your book reinforced in me is that if I ever thought about going down this path, there's going to be people impacted. I remember that movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And, you know, not all of us are going to have that friendly spirit that's going to take us around and show us what will happen. You know what I'm saying? So it's like your book, if nothing else, gives people a perspective. It's like, this is what happens with people, or what could happen with people if you decide to do that. And, or if you know somebody that's thinking about doing that, you can say, hey, look.
Right.
So if nothing else, go ahead.
No, I wanted just to add to that, which is, you know, some of the researchers I talked to, this grip of single-mindedness in which you feel, you know, like you're in a burning building and you have no other choice but to jump, that moment could pass and can pass. And so if there's a way to sort of ride it out, in other words, if you do have coping skills and you can talk to yourself and say, it is bad now, but it's like weather, it will pass. Like if you can get yourself out of that crisis moment, and you know, some people can't, but if you have the tools and have practiced, sometimes you can move out of that suicidal, you know, tunnel vision mindset, and get out of harm's way. And people who have survived suicide attempts talk about that. Like, in that moment, I thought there was no other choice, but for whatever reason, that moment passed, and I'm glad that it did. So, you know, just having perspective that moments of pain pass, which is not, I mean, it's much easier said than done, but it's a good awareness to try to internalize.
Yeah. So if people want to get the book, if people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Well, you can totally find all the information on my website, which is rachelzimmerman.net. The book is available on Amazon, from independent bookstores, Target, you know, wherever books are sold, Audible, Kindle, any form. But if you want to write to me, go through my website, and I love to talk about this stuff with anybody who's available to listen.
Well, Rachel Zimmerman, it has been an honor to have you to come on. And again, I appreciate you writing this book. More importantly, I appreciate the strength and the courage that it took for you to go on this journey and to do this and to use the skill set that you have been given to make that so. So, I hope that people go out and get it. And I hope that your voice resonates throughout the community as far as helping people get through that personal grief that they're dealing with. So I appreciate the service that you've rendered in this book.
Eric, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the thoughtful questions. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, and we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it's time for my next guest, Michelle De Leon. Michelle De Leon is the founder and CEO of World Afro Day, the 15th of September, a global day of celebration and liberation of Afro hair and identity with an estimated reach of 1.5 billion people. Michelle successfully combines her broadcasting career of 20 years with leading World Afro Day CIC. She has overcome her own struggles with Afro hair and was inspired by her 8-year-old daughter to set up the day of celebration. Since 2017, her work has influenced the UN, UK government, global brands, international media, and major celebrities. Key highlights are the Workplace Hair Acceptance Report of 2023, contributing to the EHRC 2022 guidelines to prevent hair discrimination in schools, and a speech at the United Nations in Geneva in 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Michelle DeLeon. All right. Michelle DeLeon. Did I pronounce that right?
Sort of. DeLeon.
DeLeon. Okay. All right. Michelle DeLeon. How you doing, sister? You doing good?
I am. I'm really kind of excited to be on your show.
Well, that's good. Good. First time I've had somebody say they were excited. It's like, most of the time they're like, oh, I'm honored to be on and all that. But you're the first one to actually say excited. So that's good. That's good. So you caught my attention on LinkedIn, with this activity, this celebration that you do, called World Afro Day. And I felt that it was kind of relevant because there's been a movement here in the United States, to do that. So for the audience, Ms. DeLeon is a citizen of the United Kingdom. She is not a U.S. citizen. This is not the first time I've had somebody from the United Kingdom on the show. And I've actually been on some podcasts in the United Kingdom, but I want to clarify that this sister is across the water doing this kind of activism. So I'm really, really honored because I know it's a time difference. So I'm really, really honored that you took the time to do this. So let me go ahead and get started. And how I like to start off an interview is with a quote. So this is your quote. Trust the process, embrace the journey. Just like our natural hair, life unfolds in its own beautiful and unique way. The twists, turns, and growth are all part of the masterpiece that is you. What does that quote mean to you?
Oh, that's a bit of a surprise. I'm like, oh, when did I say that? How did I say that? It just means that this journey of embracing our hair and expressing our hair in all of its forms, in all spheres of our life, takes on all these twists and turns because there's no straightforward path. Like, since I've been doing World Afro Day, there is no master plan. There's no one I can go to. There's no mentor to say, how do you change the world? How do you make the world see the light? There isn't a map. So I've had to grow it organically, figure it out organically.
Yeah. So what is World Afro Day and what was the motivation behind the celebration?
So World Afro Day is a global celebration and liberation of Afro hair and identity. It's not just about the way that our hair looks. It's about the freedom that goes with our hair. It's very much around celebration and liberation. They are linked. And the inspiration was having a daughter myself and not wanting her to experience my similar hair journey to me, wanting her to be free completely, never go through the struggle, never go through the chemicals, never go through the inferiority complex, and having I had a master plan for her, very clear that I wanted her to love, embrace, and be free to express her hair. Now, unless she lives in a bubble, I'm going to have to address the outside world. I can put in her, infuse in her, raise her with all the love and care and attention that I possibly can, but she still needs to go out into the real world. And I was aware that the real world would not reflect that necessarily back to her. So, yeah, I really wanted the world to be different for her and for her whole generation.
Yeah. So from my research, it seemed like she was singing one day And that's what kind of got you into the mold to say, yeah, we ought to do a celebration about our hair and what it means.
Yeah, I mean, she reached a pinnacle at a young age. I think she was 8 years old, and it was early morning. She was in the bathroom. She was actually praising God for having afro hair. She was saying she was a princess and saying she was grateful. Those three things are so symbolic of what we've lost that she was actually expressing in such a exuberant, free way. I questioned what I was hearing. I couldn't. It was just so wonderful. I was like, wow, what is she singing? And I just felt so inspired by what she was singing. But also it was a God moment where I was like, she can't be the only one. She must be, I want millions. I want to hear what she was singing. I wanted to hear that echoed across the world. I suddenly went from being a mother of one child to feeling this motherly love for hundreds, because there's hundreds of millions of us. There's a billion of us. And I literally went from, I'm just living my life with my child, raising my child, to, but what about all the other children on the planet? And it literally was like that. And then I went from what about all the other children to women my age, adult women who I knew were struggling, who I knew was saying the opposite things to what I was hearing. They were saying all the negative stuff. They were saying the struggle. They were saying, I don't want this hair. I don't like this hair. This hair's not the good hair. I want somebody else's hair. So I had the high of what my daughter was singing about. And then I had that contrast of, but there are so many people who don't feel like that. There are so many people who are struggling. How do I get the struggle into celebration? I often say World Afro Day was about turning struggle into celebration.
So why do you commemorate September 15th? What is the significance of that day to make that World Afro Day?
Yeah, so this is the core American connection, I think, with World Afro Day, that for many people, celebrating our hair seems fickle or frivolous or superficial or surface or cosmetic. But anyone who really knows our story knows that the hair story is as deep as it goes, really, in terms of loss, in terms of devastation, in terms of our own self-image and identity and worth. So I wanted the date because I knew it was a serious day. I knew I wanted to have serious impact. The date had to mean something, so someone couldn't just dismiss it. Oh, you're just having a bit of fun. It's another day. And then I searched for a while. What date? What date can I use for this momentum? What date can I use for this movement? What will have significance? And in America, September 15th in 2016, the state of Alabama passed a law against our hair, against dreadlocks, against having dreadlocks in the workplace, against being promoted with dreadlocks. And I thought, this is the 21st century, 2016, and we are the only people on the planet who have laws. People have decided to create laws to inhibit our economic progress and our well-being. And I was outraged. I was outraged that this could be put into law against our hair. The struggle was already there, but they've enshrined that in a law that you're going to make our hair a disadvantage, an allowable point of discrimination. What a step backwards. So I was outraged, and I thought that date is the date. That date, because I want to do something to turn. This is again, this turning the history, turning the struggle into something positive. So yes, you've done that law, but look what I'm going to do with this date.
Yeah. And there was also a court case where a young lady lost her job because she had dreadlocks, and the company said that she couldn't keep those if she wanted to stay.
That's the court case. That's the civil people took that and lost.
Yeah. And so that's been, and that kind of spurred a movement in the United States as far as laws go. But before I do that, I want to touch on a couple of things. The word texturism. Can you define that for the audience?
Texturism is a hierarchical system of looking at looser, mixed hair types, less coiled hair types as a better standard, a better quality, more beautiful, more aspirational than tighter, coilier hair texture.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to this movie, one of my favorite movies, School Days, right? Where they had a musical part. They had several musical parts in the movie, but one of them was this whole thing about good and bad hair. And you had the sisters that were like in sororities and all this stuff, talking about how, good hair, and talking about the sisters that were more Afrocentric and criticizing them. And it was a good back and forth. It was kind of funny and entertaining in a way, but the reason why it was put in the movie was to highlight the fact that that is a struggle within the African diaspora, and especially here in America, about, good and bad hair, and I think, what's his name? Chris Rock, I think, did a whole documentary about the whole industry that's based off of people trying to get their hair a certain way so they'll fit in and avoid this texturism that we all experience. A historian once stated that the dominant race established societal norms, and any deviation from those norms were labeled as unacceptable. It's a historical legacy of oppression and policing Black decisions. So you agree with that statement, right?
Yeah, we're dealing with a historical system of categorizing hair that has never shifted. And I mean, we're only really starting to shift it now. I mean, because of our own conformity and our own conditioning to see our own hair type is less, we haven't even tried to change. We haven't tried to change it. I mean, the 60s and 70s was a decade of 15 years. But what were we trying to, I don't know how much change we were expressing ourselves, but we weren't changing the systems that created that. We weren't actually changing systems. And then I often laugh because that's my dad's generation. I said, what happened to your generation? Because you then raised us and we all went to Jerry curl and relaxers. What happened? You were the parents that rocked the afros. You were the parents that Black is beautiful. You were those parents. And then you brought us up and we were in the Jerry curl and the perms. So what happened? It didn't, I don't know why. It didn't have the roots weren't deep enough.
Yeah. Cause it was like, I had an afro, when I had hair. And I even had a blowout, because one of my favorite baseball players, it was so cool. He was Cuban and he had this giant afro and he would stick that cap on and the afro would just pop out. And then when he was running after the ball, the cap would fly off and you see this afro waving in the wind as he's tracking down a fly ball and all that. And I just thought that was cool. And I said, well, let me get me a blowout too. And then I played one game and that hair was blowing my eyes. I said, nah, I'm not going to be able to do that. Not the blowout part. But you know, it was like, that was a thing growing up. I'm of that age where, yeah, we were rocking the afros and all that. And, you know, the iconic images of Angela Davis, you know, and that was her symbol of defiance, to the system. Wearing that afro, it was like, yeah, you know, that. And even now, right? When young brothers see a sister with an afro, they're attracted to her in a certain way because it exudes power, right? So yeah, let's talk about that.
Or not attracted to her because it exudes power.
Well, yeah, now that's a thing too, but let's talk about the power of hair. How does that power impact our struggle or our quest for self-determination?
The power of hair. It's a legacy. It's a generational thing. The power of hair has to be instilled in as early as possible. Because when you instill it in early, it can't be taken away. So when I've instilled it in my daughter, that is her roots. So as she navigates the system, her roots are already embedded in her hair, is a strength. So it doesn't matter what's coming at her externally, it can't shift that because that's a root, that a part of who she is, that my hair is a strength. So no matter what you're saying externally, you can't change that. So power first comes internally. The power of hair first comes internally before you see it. So if you can embed that internally, that relationship, and there's a spiritual part of it that as African people, we had a very strong spiritual connection with our hair. And we actually had a sense of being blessed to have this hair type. And if you do not feel grateful and you do not feel blessed, you don't have any power.
Yeah, one of the early Bible stories growing up that appealed to a lot of us consciously and subconsciously really was the story of Samson, right? Because his strength was connected with his hair. And when he was tricked to getting his hair cut, he lost his strength. He lost his power, even his identity. And so a lot of us related to that, you know, and with not even fully understanding the historical context of it. And then we started learning about the slave trade and how the minute that the slaves were brought on American shores, that they were all, it didn't matter male or female, young or old, they all got their hair shaven because the traders knew that they knew enough where they knew that certain hairstyles identified certain groups. And if people saw somebody with a similar hairstyle, they might get together, they might collude to rebel or whatever the case may be. So they made sure that they cut their hair so nobody could really identify who was who. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, I think it's really, really important for us to understand this and not try to trivialize it. And I'm going to get to that in this question coming up because I want to state some facts. So as of now in the United States, we've got 25 that have passed some version of what we call the Crown Act. And CROWN stands for Create a Respectful and Open Workplace for Natural Hair. There's been 2 attempts.
World.
Say that again?
World. It's open world.
Oh, okay. Open world. Okay. Because it's like the definition I pulled up, it said workplace. But, you know, Americans, we're capitalistic people, you know, so it's all about jobs. It's all about jobs for us, eh? We're not dealing with this esoteric and, you know, broad vision. It's like, it's the work, it's the open workplace, it's a job. We're trying to make sure we get paid, right?
Yeah.
So, there's been a couple of attempts at the federal level to do it in our national Congress. And it's gotten out of the House, but it hasn't, made it through the Senate for whatever reason. And even though we have 25 states that have passed it, two significant things. One, 43% of Black women still live in states where they are vulnerable to hair-based discrimination. And we had a case that was very high profile right when we were trying to coordinate when you were going to come on. This young man named Daryl George, I believe, he's been banned from his high school in Texas because his hair didn't conform to the school district. And Texas, ironically, which was kind of surprising to me, was one of the states that had passed the Crown Act law. But the school got around it because they said, well, no, we're not against the style. It's the length of the hair, right? Yeah. And so when they asked the state representative who wrote the bill, they said, well, did you consider length? And he said, well, if you understood the hairstyle, you understood that length was part of it, so we didn't put that in the legislation. So that gave the judge the wriggle room to say, well, the school district didn't violate the law because it was about length and not about style. And so this young man can't go to that school anymore. So what do you... Very sad case. Huh?
It's been a very sad case because we've been aware and watching it. And, you always play in your mind, well, how would that work in our country? What would be happening here? So, in both ways, it's happened in our country where children have been forced to leave a school because of length and style. But you've also had judges backing a Black boy's right to wear cornrows to school. So we've had both sides of it.
So you decided, and this was all leading up to, you recently decided this year, prior to the World Afro Day celebration, to have a member of parliament actually introduce legislation or actually amend the 2010 Equality Act to make Afro hair a protected characteristic. Talk about that, Cam, because it was pretty cool how you did it. It was like 100 voices, 100 words campaign. Kind of talk about the whole thing the campaign and what y'all were trying to do.
Yeah. So we've been on the journey of World Afro Day for 8 years, and it's not like the law was never in my eye line. It was, but the timing had to be right. And the evidence had to be there. So what's happened in 8 years, there's been multiple reports, multiple sets of research, not just my own. So as my own organization, I make sure I commissioned report after report after report, but also other people were creating UK-based research because a lot of it has been previously American-based research. So we've had time to build up our own body of evidence and research. And then I was able to say, dealing with the workplace, this will not change without a law change. It's too embedded into society without a legal change. And also, if you look at it from an employer's point of view, they've never been told they should not discriminate against someone because of their hair. It doesn't exist anywhere. They haven't gone to school and heard that. They haven't gone to university and heard that. They've never heard an employment training about that. So is it really their fault when something is part of society and they've never been told not to do it? So actually, the onus is on for the values of the country, and that's our laws, to say, well, what is right and what is wrong? If skin discrimination is wrong, why would you say discriminating against another part of the body is not wrong as well? The logic follows. One part of the body, that's wrong. The another part of the body, it's wrong. But it's not written in law. So it became really just so evident that to actually get this to a level of understanding, you have to have a law change. So with that in mind, it's like, well, how are we going to get people to listen? Because you're dealing with the people in power who do not have this issue. They do not understand this issue. They have no lived experience of this issue. How do you get them to the point of understanding this issue? So I thought, well, you've got to make a noise. And you've got to make a noise. Well, we've got the evidence. So I knew I had the evidence now. So I thought, right, I'm going to build an information pack for politicians. An information pack that's going to take them from point A to point Z. This is everything you need to know about this issue. So you cannot say it's not an issue here anymore. Here's the evidence. But then you have to say it matters. So the 100 Voices, 100 Words campaign is saying, okay, it's not just my organization saying it. Let's have some high profile people who you do know say it in their own words. So that's where the 100 Words and 100 Voices came from. We wanted to amplify. This matters to a lot of people, and these 100 voices are going to represent all of us. And what was good about it is, as we know, the currency of the world that we live in are celebrities and high profile people. And it was great that enough of them said, yeah, we want to give you our 100 words. We want to see this change. So we were able to speak to a politician, an MP who could say, right, Michelle, yeah, I agree with that. I want to help you take this into Parliament. Because as you know, politics is a whole different world. If you're not in that world, you will not understand the rules of how things work. So we're coming in as an outside organization. We had to connect with an MP on the inside and then make noise to say, this is something that's important and this is something that needs to change. So, and you know what? We had a lot of press coverage and we had a lot of positive press coverage. I haven't even seen anything negative about it. I didn't hear any negative. I didn't read a single negative article, a negative radio, negative piece. It was wholly saying, these people are campaigning for this change. That's what it was saying. And a lot of support kind of saying, well, actually, they've got something here, haven't they? This is what they're saying. Doesn't it matter? So, we were really happy that we were able to start the process.
Yeah. So kind of talk about what is the timeline as far as getting that done. I know the process has started because you did this like on the 10th of September. Where is the legislation now? How soon do you think that it'll be brought forward before House of Commons, I guess, for it to to go for a vote?
Yeah, do you know what? We're not at that legislation stage. With this, it's very, I don't know, I suppose the UK, I don't know how different, I suppose everybody's political systems are very different. There are different routes that you can take in the UK. You could have an individual bill brought in by an individual MP, or you can have the government do the bill. So our first choice would be to make sure that the government recognises that they should be making this change. And we're still in that process. We're literally still in that process of, I've got to send all the reports to different MPs, different ministers, different government ministers, and say, keep putting this in front of their face, so to speak. Keep putting this in front of their face. And I don't yet know how they're going to respond.
So would you feel with this new leadership that's running the country now, Do you feel that that's going to be a more receptive government for the idea as opposed to the previous? Because I guess it's the labor group, the Labor Party that's in charge now. And it's like prior to that, it was the conservatives. So do you think the labor movement is more sympathetic to what you're trying to do as opposed to the other party?
On paper, that would be the case. On paper, that should be the case. But we have to see that in reality. Put it this way. I didn't know. I was doing this anyway. I didn't know. Don't forget, they called a snap election in July. So World Afro Day is in September. So I was always planning to do this. So I didn't know there was going to be a change of government. So like with World Afro Day, from the beginning, if I went by how things were received to be my motivation, then I wouldn't do anything because the whole world says this doesn't matter. So it doesn't really matter who's in office. I know that this matters and this is a lifelong commitment of change for me.
So talk about that in a little more detail, because, in the United States, we don't have any qualms here about folks expressing when they don't like something, right? One way or the other. And, when the first Crown Act got passed in California and there was some momentum to start doing it in other states and at the federal level, folks were like saying, well, that's not important. It's like, why are y'all wasting time? We got to deal with inflation. We got to deal with unemployment. We got to deal with immigration. We got to deal with all these other issues. Why are y'all talking about hair? I mean, why is that important? So what would you say to your critics that in the UK that say, yeah, this is not at the top of our list? Why should we focus any energy toward getting this done? Why is it important for rights of people as far as their hair is concerned, for the UK and even for here?
Yeah. I suppose you have to look at what is right and what is wrong and not just the individual thing. Is it right to discriminate against children, to discriminate against people in the workplace, and to have people's health impacted because they have a different hair type? If you say that's wrong for a skin color, then why would you say that's okay for hair? It's never been okay. And we're saying it's not okay because it's wrong, actually. It's wrong to treat people, for people to experience a worse quality of life because they happen to have a different hair texture. It's morally wrong. And it's been morally wrong for hundreds of years. So why should we put up with it for any longer? You give me the reason why we should put up with it, as opposed to you should change. It's very clear. The evidence is now there to say this is impacting the quality of people's lives. It always has done. It's just that we have never positioned it that way. If you just say, oh, I don't like something, or it upsets me, it's not enough. We're going beyond that. We're saying morally it's wrong, the same way skin discrimination is wrong. And we're saying that it affects the quality of people's lives. Why should children feel like they're inferior? 41% of children with Afro hair want straight hair. Why should they feel like they should become different in order to be accepted in society? Do we think that's morally acceptable? No, we don't. So we do something about the things that are wrong.
Yeah.
I'm very much, I'm a woman of faith. I'm a woman of God. And I believe when something's wrong and unjust, you deal with it, whether you think it's important or not. Because actually, if it's unjust, it is unjust. You don't say, You don't accept what's unjust. That's the point of justice.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with that. I mean, you know, that was my motivation when I was elected. And that's the motivation that those of us in different parts of the African diaspora have been trying to address. You know, regardless.
There's another thing. Equality laws and the concept of equality doesn't really help us when it comes to hair. And I think I'm starting to get people to understand. You have to get, there's an empathy side of the story here. Ask a white person, do you want to be forced to wear afros, dreadlocks and cornrows in order to progress in life? Everyone would say no. So why then would we be forced to do the same? You have to treat others as you would want to be treated. If you, in your political position, do not want to be forced to wear my hairstyles, then why should I be forced to wear yours?
Amen.
We don't have equal hair. There's nothing equal about our hair. We have very different hair. There's nothing equal about straight hair and afro hair. They're just diametrically opposite. How would you say they're similar? They're not even any bit similar. So would you like to be forced to look like us? Would you like to be forced to wear our hair? No, you wouldn't. So, you know, why should we be forced to change our hair to look like yours?
Right. So this is more than just a one-day celebration, which is, from what I understand, it's recognized by the United Nations, is it not?
It is.
But you've developed like some organizations and you've got some scholarships. So kind of talk about that aspect, and then to kind of close out, talk to people about how they can get involved, how people can reach you and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think the biggest, most well-known aspect of what we did is the hashtag. Hashtag World Afro Day. You can look it up and you'll see it's a delight, because you see, people from all over the planet doing wonderful things to express their love and acceptance of Afro hair. You'll see artwork, you'll see photography, you'll see music, you'll see all these different ways that people are using their creativity. So it's actually a real blessing to just be a part of it, because it's such a love and a celebration, an outpouring of positivity towards our hair. But far deeper than that, it's structural change that we're looking at. It's the structural change going into nurseries, schools, providing schools with resources that teach teachers and empower children, going into workplaces that, again, give them resources to understand this actually stops you getting the best people. This stops the people that you currently have being their best. So you're not winning, you're losing out. You're losing. And then as the movement in America around relaxers, looking at, again, there's been a health cost and consequence. That's only still getting started. The research is there, but where's the legislation? Where's the protection? Where's the health warnings around our hair products? So there's so much structural work that needs to happen but the law is the underpinning of all that. Because once you have the law saying this matters, this is of value, this is important, this is right, then everything else will flow from that. So now I feel that with World Afro Day, there's always this breadth, the things that you can focus on and that you want to focus on. But actually now I'm narrowing it down to law, because once you have the momentum on, it's like I was saying to some of my colleagues, I was saying, like, you've had the natural hair movement, Now you need the legal hair movement. We as a people across the diaspora need to start saying we need legal rights for our hair. We need legal rights that says we are now a whole human being in society. And we can function as whole human beings. Without the law change, we're at 80%.
So how can people get involved? How can people reach out to you?
Yeah. So worldafroday.com is our website, and we've got a campaign which I believe can be for everybody across the diaspora, and it's called Fix the Law, Not Our Hair. So if you don't have any kind of legal, protection in your country, then go to our website, and we're launching on October 15th, so there's a bit of time, our Fix the Law, Not Our Hair t-shirts, and start being a message. Wear that t-shirt, have those conversations. What law? Why does your hair need protecting? So Fix the Law, Not Our Hair is like a global message for us to get to the point where, we want to be a whole human being society, and our hair is part of that wholeness. So we need these laws put in place. And also we've got another thing on our website, things that you can do with schools. So again, you can get schools involved in writing letters to their legal representatives. You can get schools to write letters to whoever the leader is of your country. You can get schools the kids to write poems, write posters, start from a really young age. Because if you think about it, any law that comes into place, they're the generation that get to live it out. That's a wonderful legacy for them. You train them up to be part of that movement where their hair is going to be respected. It's going to be validated legally. So yeah, that's how everybody else, I think, can get involved. Just, be a part of it. Be a part of the change.
All right. Well, Michelle De Leon, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate your initiative and your commitment to see this through. And I wish you much success in the UK. And I hope that next time we talk, we'll have even more states engaged in protecting our young folks. And, cause again, I'm a supporter. I'm a bystander. I don't have any hair to fight for, but seriously though, I really commend you for what you've done. And, I wish you much success, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right, guys. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So let me thank Rachel Zimmerman for coming on and talking about her book, Us After, and the delicate subject dealing with suicide. And again, as we mentioned in the interview, this is Suicide Prevention Month. As this podcast ends, it'll be the end of it, but the awareness still needs to be there. And again, if you are feeling depressed or you're thinking about it, try to get some help first. Dial 988 and make sure that you reach out to somebody, because how you feel doesn't just impact you. It impacts those people who care about you. So I thank Rachel again for the courage to write the book and to come on the podcast. And then also Michelle De Leon for talking about World Afro Day and the importance of another aspect of our self-determination, right? Because as she stated, how can you discriminate against somebody for the way they wear their hair, but you can't discriminate against somebody for the way that they look or their skin tone or whatever. So I wish her much success in pursuing the political aspect of World Afro Day and trying to get laws passed in UK. And I encourage other state legislatures to join in the other 25 states and get Crown Acts passed in their state. But I want to close out because I want to deal with a subject that has been in the news and is something that's really, really close to me. And I say close not because I knew a particular individual, but the issue is something that has been very, very near and dear to me. As I went through my journey as far as being a state legislator. A man named Marcellus Williams, who was 55 years old, was executed in the state of Missouri. And he went through all the appeals processes. It came down to the 6 justices of the United States Supreme Court to allow that execution to go through. Governor could have stopped it. This governor, I guess it's Parsons, I think his name was, or is. He could have stopped it. Attorney General could have stopped it. But they didn't. And there are questions about jury selection. There's questions about evidence tampering. There's questions about whether the brother was even present when the murder took place. Even the family of the victim wanted at least his sentence commuted to life, so that way if he could prove that he wasn't the one to do it, then he'd still be alive to fight it. But nonetheless, he was executed. During my time in the state legislature, I've fought against the death penalty. I have made religious arguments, made economic arguments, and I've made moral conscience arguments. I don't think we should pass laws to adjudicate people who kill people if the state is going to kill people too. Especially if the way the decision is rendered, that an individual, more likely a judge, makes that call. Everybody always makes Pontius Pilate the villain in the Easter story. But we have a bunch of Pontius Pilates acting as governors of our respective states, especially in states where they seem to be set on executing prisoners. Now, I'm not here to take away the pain of losing a loved one. I'm not here to defend somebody's guilt or innocence. My position is the death penalty should not be an option. Period. And I've had family in other countries, living in other countries, and talk about the big ceremonies, and I've read through history about how people were executed. I've been to county courthouses where they used to have people either hanging or being electrocuted in public view. And I just think at some point in time that if we're going to be an evolved society, we're going to say that we stand on the rule of law, that barbarism should not be a part of the law. And that's all executing a person is. It's more of a form of retribution instead of form of justice. And I was glad that I had a colleague, John Mayo, that fought that battle with me in the legislature, even forcing a committee to even deal with the legislation. We didn't prevail, of course, but it's a fight worth having. And as long as I am able to have a platform, as long as I'm able to think and express my opinions, one thing will always be certain, is that I am against the death penalty. Especially because of the fallibility. It will mean nothing 10 years from now if somebody enlightened in the Missouri State House realizes that Marcellus Williams did not have to be executed. It may look good on the record, may provide a moment of satisfaction for the family. Of Mr. Williams, but it will cause additional pain to the family of the young lady who was killed, because now the person who was adjudicated and executed, turns out that wasn't the person. And I just think about, what if Donald Trump had gotten his wish and Yusef Salaam was executed? We never would have had a story with a happy ending concerning the exonerated five. Brother Salaam would not be on the city council of New York. Who knows what this world would be like without Brother Yusef and those other four young men. So, I'm not going to take up too much time, but I just wanted to be clear. America is supposed to be a place about freedom. It is also supposed to be a place about second chances, about redemption. Nobody can be redeemed if they're already dead. If you want to put somebody away in prison for life without parole, okay. But even in prison, person who truly reforms can actually have an impact on people that are getting out of prison, just by guiding them and telling them not to do what they did, right? But you can't do that if you execute it. And not everybody's going to be like Jesus, and after 3 days show back up. That's not how this operates. Human beings are given a lot of freedom and a lot of power, especially free will. But they should not have the power of life and death. And then some people say, well, what about abortion, all that? Look, it's already hypocrisy for people to say that they're pro-life, and they're the main ones literally voting to execute another human being. And then there's some folks saying, well, why didn't Vice President Harris say anything? Well, why didn't Donald Trump say anything? If you want to go there. The fact of the matter is, everybody should be against the death penalty in the United States. There was a time in this country where the death penalty was outlawed. And then some political leaders got scared and thought that a way to stem crime was to reinstitute it. Bloodlust should not be a part of our judicial system. Period. End of discussion. And until we abolish the death penalty for good, we will never be the nation that we need to be. Until we eliminate this discrimination for good, we will never be the nation that we need to be. When we stop rewarding people for lying to us, that's when we'll start ascending. There used to be a saying, the clearest conscience a man could sleep on. The softest pillow, a man could sleep on was a clear conscience. And I've just come to the conclusion that people are comfortable sleeping on rocks now. We can tolerate mass shootings. We can tolerate genocide. We can tolerate abhorrent behavior in our political leaders. And we can tolerate the state executing other human beings. But we can't tolerate people being who God made them to be. We can't tolerate people making a decision about who they love. We can't tolerate how people want their health care to be. But we can tolerate barbarism. We can tolerate bad behavior. That has to end. And I hope in my lifetime that we can get back to a place where America says no more to the death penalty. Until next time.